And we are today grappling with the question that he foresaw 20 years ago when we first started working on this. What does it mean to be human in the age of AI? What does it mean to be a child, to an adult, to be a leader? What does it mean for economics? What does it mean for jobs? All of that. Because we as humans have never had a competitor that is not human, but of similar or greater level of intelligence. And it is unpredictable what we human will do.
So Google's former CEO, Eric Schmidt, just gave a pretty shocking interview at the Harvard Kennedy School. He warned that AI will automate everything at a massive scale in the next 2 years, and it's going to get really difficult for us humans to compete with it. He also warned that the pace at which China is moving, it will easily defeat the US in the coming years. Let's watch the interview and I'll dissect everything as we go along.
So the question is, what happens over time? So you have language, agents, and reasoning. Well, isn't that what we do? Right? We do stuff, we communicate, and we do actions. So the San Francisco consensus is that at some point, that stuff comes together and you get what is called technically recursive self-improvement. And recursive self-improvement is when it's learning on its own. This is not true today. Today, when you set up one of these huge data centers, you know what they look like, you have to tell it what to learn. But the belief is that this is coming, and there's lots of evidence that this is coming. The ability for computers to write programs, to generate mathematical conjectures, to discover new facts looks like it's very, very close. Many people believe that there will be new math design, new mathematicians, AI mathematicians to love in the next year. So we collectively as an industry believe that this is going to happen soon. If you ask the San Francisco people, they'll say 2 years, which is really soon. If you ask me, I double that to 4 years, which is really soon, right? So it's happening very quickly. I want, and Henry certainly wanted it, we want it to be built with American values and human values. There is a point, in my view, and we talked a lot about this, where somebody's gonna have to raise their hand and say, we just went too far. There's too much danger here. We don't want to give that agency to the computer. We want humans to be in charge of it. It is not agreed to where that point is, but our book spends a lot of time talking about where that might be. Another example would be that you discovered that the computer has decided on its own to get access to weapons. That's clearly like everyone would agree that's not a good idea, right? It's bad enough that humans have access to weapons. Imagine if the computer has it. And what are the criteria by which? And you can think of many other such examples.
Next, Eric talks about how China is going to defeat the US in the field of AI within the next 2 to 3 years.
My own view is that the gap will widen, but for different reasons. I think that the Chinese focus is largely, as I mentioned, on embedding AI in everything. Smart toasters, cars, so forth and so on. They're moving much more quickly than the robots. I think that the vast majority of humanoid robots will be Chinese AI powered and Chinese AI manufactured simply because they know how to drive the cost of things down. Their supply chains are incredible, their cost management, they work so hard, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. So my guess is that it's true that the gap will probably get larger, but the real question is, will you as a consumer ultimately have a better experience as a consumer with a Chinese product than a US product? And the answer is, from a fit and finish, probably the Chinese product. And that's of concern. My own opinion is that, which is not, I'm not sure, but I think so, that the large companies will ultimately not release their largest models. It'll be too dangerous to do so, that they'll subset them. That's what I would do. No, I assume that they'll come to that decision. I think the most interesting question is open versus closed. For those of you who don't have a background in this, open source, open weights. Open source is what I did for decades. When you use any form of computer, much of the software that you're using was developed by open source, which meant that the source was published and people would collectively advance it. And there was a whole movement around this, which I was part of. So I'm relentlessly open source in my view. The major companies are closed source largely for economic reasons. Basically, if you borrow $50 billion from the financial market, they do want a return. And saying to them, oh, by the way, we're going to give all the models away and you won't get your return probably isn't a very good legal or financial strategy. So the American model seems to have emerged as closed. Strangely, the Chinese model is completely open weights, open source. Why? I don't know. One possible explanation is that the Chinese government has figured out that they were losing in closed source because they couldn't get the hardware, and open source, because it's free, gives them proliferation. So one of the consequences of open source, open weights is the vast majority of humans on the planet will use Chinese models. Why? Because they're free, right? And most countries cannot afford the computing and the data centers and so forth. They're just going to take the Chinese models for free and embed them. Now, is that an issue? Absolutely, because it comes with Chinese values, Chinese training, Chinese biases, and so forth. We would prefer to have it be American. We will see. There's a couple of open source projects in America that I am a supporter of, but they can't raise the $10 billion that are needed from the public markets to get to where they're going. So they are gems, but they're not at the scale. I've argued that the US government should help fund them. I've argued that philanthropists should help fund them, but I don't really know.
Okay, this next part, Eric Schmidt talks about how AI is becoming conscious as we advance towards AGI and ASI.
I'm curious how you think about consciousness in AI, and if you do think that there's a possibility that AI is or will become conscious, what that looks like, what model welfare looks like in that case.
Well, let me ask you a simple question. So I'm going to give Graham credit for being conscious, and in return, he appears to be conscious, and in return, Graham is going to give it to me. So for purposes of argument, the computer is on the table.
Yeah.
And we ask the computer, are you conscious? And it says, yes. And so you, being the smart graduate student here at Harvard, come up with a series of questions. It answers every question correctly. How do we know? How could you know that the computer is conscious? How would you understand its internal reasoning state? Now, you could instrument the way its reasoning works, which people are now doing. What they're doing is they're watching what are called supernodes within the weight structure to watch how it's actually making its decisions. So maybe you could discover consciousness by inspection, but that's speculation.
Okay, so this next part's pretty interesting. Eric talks about how both nations, the US and China, conceive the upcoming threat of AI differently.
What would you identify as like a key distinguisher in China's AI automating business that you think the US needs to catch up on, or at least in the Silicon Valley startups nowadays?
What is your PhD topic?
I work on reasoning for large language models.
Perfect. Right? So what is your time frame for AGI?
I'd give it like 6 to 7 years.
Yeah, you see, not San Francisco consensus, East Coast consensus.
Good.
We will see. You may be right. I think that it has to do, I think, with the grandeur of the dreams. When I'm in China, I don't hear the same rhetoric as I do in California. In California, it's 2 years. The world will change. No one is ready. This is happening so fast, and so forth and so on. It's this sort of rhetoric that drives, and it's self-reproducing. It's a belief system. It's like a religion. Now, it always takes longer than the dreamers say. I don't hear that in China. It's noticeably different. So, for example, with reasoning, you know what DeepSeek did with R3. They did a fantastic job. They invented a new way of doing supervised fine-tuning. I mean, really, really clever stuff. You just don't hear it at a national scale. And by the way, DeepSeek is a national champion for China, right? They literally now are, they're on the list of famous companies. They're getting an enormous amount of money. Last time I met with them, they said, we've solved our hardware problem, which was code for the government is just going to give them a lot of chips, right? Welcome to a communist country.
In the next part, Eric warns that China is going bonkers in the AI field, and they're moving too fast for us to compete.
Well, let me say that I think there's no higher duty than to preserve human agency and human freedom, right? The things that we value collectively the most. And I think that's going to be a central challenge for all of you when you graduate. All of you will be facing these issues, and they're complicated and they're subtle. Imagine if the internet had been invented by China and it didn't have the kind of openness that the internet has today. It was under the Chinese internet. It looks like China is pursuing a different strategy than what I'm talking about. In my most recent visit to China, the way I operate is I ask engineers technical questions because they don't lie to you, whereas kind of everyone else, I'm not so sure. And I eventually figured out that what the Chinese are doing is they're really, really focused on applying AI in their businesses. and they're going to outcompete with us. We will lose to China for their incredible adoption of AI in every product, because they're just relentless and they work so hard. It's called 996, 9 in the morning, 9 in the evening, 6 days a week. Illegal, by the way, in China. Illegal in America, right? But nevertheless practiced. They're coming. They do not appear to be as focused on superintelligence and the path that I was describing as the San Francisco consensus. Of course, that could change. So it appears that the two are pursuing different paths. One of the questions for you all at the graduate level, even undergraduates, given it's Harvard, is start figuring out what happens when these divergent paths hit roadblocks, right? Because they both have it. Example would be in America, we have essentially produced no new electricity because it's very hard to provision electricity. China has infinite electricity because of their incredible investment in renewables and so forth. They built something like 120 gigawatts of new renewable energy in the last 5 years. It's some number like that.
No. Wait. Every day in China, Thursday, Saturday, Monday, every day, another gigawatt of electricity is added to the grid.
Well,
all year.
That's pretty extraordinary.
All year,
pretty
every day.
So my point is, and here, by the way, just to give you an example, how big is a nuclear power plant? About 1.5 gigawatts. So that's the scale of the electricity revolution that's going on in China. Again, using those numbers. How many of those kinds of plants have we built in America? 0. And we're certainly losing the renewables race to China for the reasons that everybody here knows. So they have a lot of power, right? We don't. We have a lot of chips. They don't. It sets up the competition, right? And each will pursue different ways. One of the technical questions, there's something called diffusion, where what you do is you take a very powerful model. We'll use Gemini 3, the top one at the moment. And you ask it 10,000 questions, and you take the answers. And then the system can learn from the questions and answers enough to mimic, without the expense of doing the big training, the big model. So again, thinking through the strategies that China will pursue and the strategies that are available for America is probably pretty important. What's interesting is both countries are relying on the private sector to do this. You would have thought in Henry's period that you would have used the government. But in fact, our government cannot move this quickly, the compensation systems and so forth. It turns out it's probably true for the Chinese as well. I don't know at the security level if this is true, but I've not found any large, weird Manhattan-type projects within China, although there's plenty of people in the private companies that are working hard on national security.
Next, the host asked Dr. Schmidt how our world will look in the next 2 to 3 years with AI creeping into every field that humans once dominated.
When I started, when I was in high school, I was an early programmer, and I delighted in writing code. When I went to college and graduate school, that's all I ever wanted to do. I ignored all these history things and things like this. I was the definition of a nerd at the time. And everything that I did in my 20s, which got me to where I am, has now been completely automated. Every aspect of the programming that I did, every aspect of the design is now done by computers. I recently had it write a whole program for me, and I'm sitting there watching it define the classes and the detail of the interactions and so forth as it's generating. I go like, holy crap, the end of me. And I think I've been doing programming for 55 years. So to see something start and then end in front of your own life and you're still alive is really profound, I might say. Now, computer science is not going away. The computer scientist will be, at least until the computer scientist gets replaced, will be supervising this. But the ability to generate code at the power that these systems can do is revolutionary. It means that each and every one of you has a supercomputer and a super programmer in your pocket. Now, nobody here is a terrorist, right? But it's always easier to use negative examples. There's plenty of, I'll use a stereotype, young men living in the basement, their mothers give them food, and they sit there on the equivalent of crypto 4chan, paranoia, whatever, pick your poison. They all have the ability to use these tools to build incredibly powerful systems, right? Cyber attacks, other things, whatever they care about. there's some evidence that I think it's Mangione, the fellow who killed the insurance executive, was into some of this. And there's some people were looking at some of his writings. Of course, he's in jail now, but that he was somehow influenced with that. Now, I'm not proving causality here, but it's an example of some of the darkest recesses of humanity. You give those people these kinds of tools, we have to be ready. Now, the industry is well aware of this, and we're working on it. It's very important that the defensive systems be capable. The eventual solution to AI, by the way, bad AI, is AI fighting good AI, fighting bad AI. And that's how it will resolve itself.